Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murder. This is Jeff Jones, and with me today is the full panel. We are at full power. Love to see it. Glad to see everybody here. So let's get right to it and meet the panel for today. We usually start from the top. Let's start from the bottom today and welcome Jack first. Hey, Jack, how you doing?
Doing very well, thanks very much. Hello to the panel and everyone in live chat. Hope everyone's out there is doing well. So, yeah, let's get to it, man.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Jack. And Big Jeff, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. I'm recovering nicely from my knee surgery, getting around better and better. And I'd like to say hi to everybody here in the live chat and on the panel. It's gonna be another good one. I got the feeling. And we know that you have a lot of viewing choices. I mean, I'm morbidly, sort of fixated on this Idaho case. I think like everybody else is. And thanks for tuning in to watch us talk about the man case, which is very important to us on the panel. So looking forward to another good one.
Yeah, thank you, Big Jeff. I often think that too, of all the millions, or I don't even know if it's billions of different choices for people to do with their media choices every day, and they choose our podcast. I really appreciate that, guys out there. Thank you for bringing that, Big Jeff. Great comment. Kellie, how you doing? Good morning.
Good morning. It's good to be here, and welcome everyone in chat, and hello panel.
Well, hello, right back to you. Last but not least, Dr. Silkman, welcome back again.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and a big hello to everyone on the panel and everyone in chat. It's great to be here, and just to echo what Big Jeff has said and others, yeah, I also have been following the Idaho 4 case, and a new case that I'm really interested in is the Anna Walsh case as well. And very interested to see the forensic evidence and how those cases unfold. But it's great to be here to continue our excellent series. Thank you very much.
Megan, we just learned about an hour ago that the Wisconsin Department of Justice has filed a motion trying to stop Dassey's release.
He's going to be behind those bars here for at least one more day as the state filed an emergency order to stop him from getting out. Wisconsin Attorney General Brad Schimmel notes Dassey's lawyers claim his confession was coerced. Schimmel says even if it was, that doesn't mean Dassey didn't actually sexually assault, kill, and mutilate Teresa Halbach. Accordingly, Dassey's release should be regarded as a serious public safety issue.
This is the major problem that we all face. If the Attorney General is so adamant of keeping Brendan Dassey behind bars and not to allow his release, it basically means that he's 100% convinced in the guilt of Brendan Dassey. And no matter what judge or whoever finds that things were done incorrectly, when the Attorney General comes out strongly like this, you have to ask the question, why? Why is the Attorney General being so interested in the Brendan Dassey case? And I think we all know the reason why, right, guys?
To protect the verdict against Stephen.
Absolutely no question. And it's really disgusting and shameful that Brendan Dassey is just a political pawn in a very, very sick game.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Silkman for that very logical and measured response to the comments of Brad Schimmel. I'd like to give you a more emotional. To say that just because his confession wasn't coerced doesn't mean he didn't do it is a complete and total crock of shit, right? A total crock of shit, because they have no basis to make the claim that he did do it, because as we were discussing before the podcast, there is not one lick of forensic evidence that implicates Brendan. Only his coerced words. If you toss that out, then there's nothing. Why don't they put Barb in jail? Because there's similarly no evidence that she didn't do it either, or me, right? Put me in jail, right? He didn't do it either, right? I mean, it is utter nonsense his rights are completely and totally violated because when they throw out that confession, there's absolutely nothing, zero, linking him to anything even prosecutable. It's just unbelievable. Those statements are irresponsible, pandering, and as Dr. Silkman very adeptly pointed out, simply there, to protect their verdict against Stephen, all going back to 1985 and the multi-million-dollar, $36 million lawsuit. Just unbelievably infuriating statements from Mr. Schimmel.
Yep, 100% correct. And we mustn't forget that Brad Schimmel was or is very good friends with Ken Kratz. The two were actually in a band together, believe it or not, called Alibi. And it's rather disturbing, like I said, when the state's attorney general gets personally involved in a case, and as Big Jeff alluded to, once the first domino falls down, then the case, I believe, against Stephen becomes much weaker, right? And it's pretty obvious that the state do not want to release Brendan. If they do, Brendan then has the freedom to talk, potentially to talk to press and others. And, once you get that message out into the community that, look, I was coerced, I never did any of this, it's going to put the spotlight straight back on the prosecutorial team. Brad Schimmel does not want that to happen. And unfortunately for Brendan, he's been kept in prison, I believe, as a political prisoner, basically, as Big Jeff said, to protect the verdicts.
And not only to protect the prosecutorial team, but to protect the investigatory team too, right? To protect Wiegert and Fassbender, because once it becomes, clear to the public at large that they engaged in conduct that was, basically, coercing a 16-year-old boy, bullying him, not letting him get in a word in edgewise, just fudging with his mind. Once that gets out as to what type of, tactics that they were willing to stoop to, and people are going to start to say, "Oh well, what else? What else did they do here that they needed to get this kid?" So, but what else did they do? I think that's also going to raise eyebrows as well.
Correct, and I'm sure Jack 61 is going to comment on it in a second. But the Foul Play team did a podcast on this very nature, in which two academics looked into Brendan Dassey's confession, and Jack 61, I'm sure, will comment on it.
Yeah, actually, they did this under the hood research paper. It's really well done, and talking about the judicial process and Brendan's. Basically, they looked at his language, his use of language. They compared, just briefly, how much these investigators spoke during these interrogations versus how much Brendan spoke. It's really quite eye-opening. It's a really good paper. And it's not that long either. Actually, you can get a lot of information. But yeah, Brad, you guys have really pretty much covered what everything with Brad Schimmel. I detest him for his actions. He may be a very sound legal mind for all I know, because I really haven't dove deep into who this guy is, but this is the way he handled everything, the way he talked. Every time he talked, we've talked about this, every time he talked about the case, he has to drag the hall box into it, even though they've said almost nothing publicly, and certainly nothing in recent years. So, I just can't take him. I can't take him with any real seriousness, because, as you guys have said, his job was clearly to protect that verdict and keep Brendan locked up. I will mention before I stop talking here, after he left office as AG, he's now a judge. So, isn't that interesting?
Who's surprised by that?
Yeah, I hear you, man.
Jack, I do have a little I'd like to use the state's words, their own words against them, because this is what they said about Judge Duffin, and they accused Judge Duffin of being wrong. And I think it was Schimmel actually himself, wrong on the facts and wrong on the law.
Correct.
And I believe
Yeah.
that is exactly where we find Brad Schimmel in this scenario. Wrong on the facts, wrong on the law.
Remember, of course, that Brad Schimmel wanted to make sure that he took the heat off his own department, right? The Attorney General's office. You don't want any investigators coming in and basically going through his office and having a look at potentially past cases, et cetera, and that goes to show the importance, and I'm sure Jack 61 will back me up on this, the importance of Stephen Avery's initial civil lawsuit against the MTSO, Kaseric and Vogel, because it wasn't the money that was important. It was basically getting justice for what they did to him, because Stephen was targeted back in 1985 and potentially could have meant a clean sweep through the Attorney General's office, the MTSO, and could have exposed high-level corruption, not only in the Stephen Avery case, but in other cases. For example, the hit-and-run murder of Ricky Hochschletter, right, guys? So it was very important to put a lid on everything. So if you release Brendan Dassey, you now have a chink, right? You've got weakness in your case that will eventually fall back and say, okay, did it really occur the way the state said it? You don't want to take that risk. So you put a lid on it and keep Brendan in prison. It's truly a truly shocking scenario, guys.
Yeah, Doc, I was just going to comment that I was actually thinking one of the things you brought up, and that's the civil suit. And this past, we've read, many of the depositions, but this past Sunday, we read two relatively short ones. One was Steve Tinker. He was one of the AAGs, a lawyer, like all of them are. And then another one, Monica Burkhart-Brist, another attorney that worked within the AG's office, both in the time frame, in real time. This is spring 2005, and Glenn and Kellie asking these really pretty serious questions to these lawyers, and there's no way that Brad Schimmel wanted to revisit any of that. Not even close. That's the reason I said that. He didn't want anyone questioning anything inside that office.
To make a decision on this by tomorrow. Of course, Dassey's family has said they hope to have him home by Thanksgiving. In Portage, Nick Bohr, WISN 12 News.
This morning, Judge Duffin reviewed the state's motion and concluded that they just rehashed what they had said before, and there was no reason for him to change his mind. So Judge Duffin, in his decision, based upon the home visit, the interviews, the review of Brendan's records, based upon all of that, ordered that Brendan be released no later than Friday at 8 o'clock.
If I could just have a second, I think it's important to just review for 1 second exactly what the nature of Judge Duffin's review was, just from a 50,000 foot level. Which and you guys can correct me if I'm if I get some of the words wrong here, but I think what it basically said was that that based on his ruling, there's no way that any reasonable jury could possibly have convicted him, or based on this evidence, or have reasonably assumed, I should say, that this confession was not coerced. No possible way to believe that. I think that's the nature of the ruling that he had to make in a habeas corpus case. And can you guys maybe help clarify that a little? Because I think that's really important to get out. Because we're going to see it happen not once. We're going to see it happen by the three judge panel again, and then they barely skate by in the end thing.
The important thing to realize here is that to obtain habeas corpus is extremely, extremely rare. And I think we're going to see in the MAM series upcoming, they actually quote the percentages. I can't remember the percentages off the top of my head, but it's very, very low that a case makes it all the way to habeas corpus and a judge agrees. It basically meant that what Judge Duffin concluded, his finding is serious. So it basically meant that there was a mistake made in the initial putting up his confession, Brendan Dassey's confession, that it was an error because it was a form of coercion of Brendan Dassey. Now, if Judge Duffin can find this, and he actually gave the reasons why he ruled that confession inadmissible, and as Jack 61 pointed out, we also did, the Foul Play team did a presentation of those two academics who went through the confession and essentially found the same thing. In fact, they were even more scathing, right, Jack 61? For me, what begs the question is, how come external people can see that Brendan Dassey's confession was coerced, was worthless, and needed to be thrown out, yet members of the Wisconsin legal fraternity believe that it wasn't coerced and deemed admissible? There's something not right, guys. It doesn't match.
Yeah, I think to add to what Big Jeff and Doc are saying, but Big Jeff, he quoted, or I think he may have mentioned, I don't want to say quoted, that's the wrong word, the totality of the case, the totality of, I won't say evidence, but I think totality of things that had happened to Brendan over time. He considered all of it. It wasn't just isolated statements, which is what law enforcement did, which is also what this Wisconsin law academia or these lawyers did. They pulled out these statements out of thin air and tried to cobble them together instead of taking everything from the beginning, November 6th, 2005, and run through to whenever Judge Duffin ended what he based his decisions on. I think that it is a head scratcher, and there's just absolutely no way, from everything that we've seen, everything that we've heard, they took this kid and this continued to screw him. And Brad continued on the same path because they do not want him out. They don't want him out speaking to the public, as Doc said, to the news media people, giving interviews to, we may not particularly care for him, or maybe you do, Dr. Bill, and some of these other people that have millions of people that watch their programming. They don't want that. They know the trouble they could spell for the Avery case. You take Brendan away, what we've said before, it severely weakens the case against Stephen Avery.
Imagine if Brendan Dassey went on Dr. Phil and he actually won over the audience, and people connected to Brendan as if to think this kid did nothing, right? Could you imagine the millions of people watching that interview on national television realize that this kid was set up, right? That will turn the case. That will turn the tide. And so if you think making a murderer was a big shitstorm for the state, could you imagine if they released Brendan Dassey and he did an interview with an attorney next to him on Dr. Phil? All hell would have broken loose. Brad Schimmel knew what the consequences were, guys. He knew what the domino effect would be, and he pulled the rug right under Brendan and his family. Imagine that, guys. Your parents are waiting for you to come home. They've got the room ready. They've got everything ready. And boom, Brad Schimmel shuts the door 1 minute to midnight. That's how bad it was.
The family is over the moon. Brendan and his mother spent 10 Thanksgivings apart. And the idea that he could be home by Thanksgiving is, I mean, talk about tasting gratitude.
Some wonder why current Attorney General Brad Schimmel is fighting so hard to keep Dassey locked up.
I have to approach this from a perspective of the family of Teresa Halbach. And
there he is again, doing it again, right? You know, you got to put the family, use the family. And frankly, I find it to be a little inappropriate to continually hide behind a tragedy that the family went through and make it seem like, well, the Halbachs get to decide. And I've said this before, but I feel like I need to say it again. Well, no, the Halbachs get to decide what we do, not the law. And it's not the correct posture. And it really drives me nuts. And I know it drives you guys nuts too.
Well, he's oh, sorry, Big Jeff.
I was just going to say, it's a common prosecutorial tactic to try and inflame, a jury by the, by the level of atrocity of the crime, right? I mean, when you start listing off how badly, what happened to this poor girl, and all of a sudden the eyes of the jury starts to get wider, but not much different than the Idaho case, right? As we hear about the level of viciousness of those attacks, it only makes us more inflamed, and we have to be cautious that there is a presumption of innocence here, and that's exactly what he's trying to take away with those comments. Oh, the Halbachs, harkening back to, what happened to their poor daughter. Well, if you have this underlying assumption in that statement that it was the accused, that it was Brendan. You just can't do that. That is not fair. That is not how the justice system is supposed to work. Because it's the lady with the blindfold and the scales. Where's the blindfold?
For Brendan, there was never a presumption of innocence. Same with Stephen. That presumption of innocence was gone the moment those press conferences were done by Mr. Kratz. And it goes to show that Brad Schimmel is your consummate politician. He's using all the right words. And have a look at him. Have a look at his demeanor. He knows that he's basically using the sympathetic vote from the public, and he's now quoting the Halbach family. Well, what about asking the Halbachs themselves whether the state can keep on riding on their coattails? Because never once, I've never seen any of the Halbach family come out and do a press conference or a news conference or be involved in some type of media event talking about Brendan Dassey, Stephen Avery. No, nothing whatsoever. It's only people like Kratz, Brad Schimmel, and Fassbender who go on these speaking tours that keep on talking about the Halbach family. And it's going to be really bad. Think about it, guys. It's going to be really bad for the Halbach family if it is eventually discovered that both Stephen and Brendan did not murder Teresa Halbach and were completely innocent. If it's bad now, could you imagine the fallout that's going to happen if both of them are exonerated, right? Clearly, they do not want to get to the truth, to the bottom of the matter. They just want to hide behind the Halbach family and keep Brendan and Stephen in prison.
It would certainly rob them of their closure, and it would make anyone who led them along this primrose path of, that sort of led Mike Halbach to make those statements pre-trial that he was making with the certainty that he was making them, make them feel really bad that they were misled in that way. So yeah, they have those tracks to cover as well too, especially since they keep on bringing them up. So it would, I agree, it would be bad for them, and it would be bad for the people who put them there in that state of mind.
And you know, I really do have an issue with Mike Hallbach being the family so-called spokesman, making all these comments. Oh yeah, they're guilty. Oh yeah, he never told the truth. And remember, Jack 61, when the reporter actually said to him and asked him about Brendan Dassey's confession, and Mike Hallbach goes, "Yeah, it's all on tape." And the reporter actually asked him, "Well, have you actually listened to the tape? Have you listened to his confession?" What did he say, Jack 61?
He said no.
He said,
He hadn't watched it.
He said no. Correct. He said no.
They've got no opportunity to hug her on Thanksgiving. And this is until we sort out with certainty whether that jury's verdict against Brendan Dassey will stand or not. We need to keep him where he is.
Basically, the state is doing whatever they can to keep this from happening. Right now, the ball's in the 7th Circuit. Good afternoon. This is Bob Dvorak calling from Milwaukee. I'm wondering who the duty judge is this week. I'm calling about the Dassey case. Yeah, okay. So we don't know who it's going to. Okay, thanks. Bye.
This is breaking news now from today's TMJ4.
And that breaking news, Brendan Dassey will remain in prison pending the outcome of an appeal. The U.S. Court of Appeals in Chicago just made that ruling.
Now, the 3-judge panel out of Chicago didn't offer an opinion on why it issued the stay. It simply granted it. This is the same court that will ultimately decide whether or not to overturn the August ruling by Judge William Duffin that overturned Dassey's conviction. In response to today's order, Dassey's legal team released.
I think this really highlights what a true mockery the criminal justice system is in Wisconsin, right? You put in a habeas corpus petition, which is incredibly difficult to obtain, and I think everyone will agree. You have an impartial judge who doesn't know Brendan Dassey, who went through everything, right? Looked at the so-called confession. He spent, I believe, 10 months, going over this. He wrote a 91-page report, I think it was, Jack 61. It was a very extensive response. And to think that that was not enough to get Brendan Dassey released because it meant that the state had a second bite of the cherry goes to show how corrupt and perverse the criminal justice system is. It means that they never were going to accept the decision by a third-party arbiter who had no skin in the game. So in other words, all Brad Schimmel had to do was wait until he got the decision he wanted while keeping Brendan Dassey locked up. So guys, where is the fairness in that?
Nowhere to be found.
I don't think there is any. I bitched about this, last time I think we talked about this ability to, not being satisfied with a 3-judge panel in the 7th Circuit. I don't like that call. And again, I don't care if it's for the defense or for the state. You have 3 qualified judges come to a decision, and they do this so they can handle more cases. I don't like that call. Let's see if we can get together and get the en banc hearing scheduled. And that's rarely granted either. That's less than 5% of the cases will they go to an en banc and get all the available judges to discuss the case and, potentially come to another ruling. I don't know. It feels wrong. Why would you have the 3-panel judge system if you're not willing to accept it. You do one or the other. And we also talked about this. If it is questioned and goes to an en banc, I think in order to, I don't think they could even do it. Somebody has suggested if that happens, and it automatically gets reheard by or gets heard by the Supreme Court.
I was going to say that's why the Federal Court of Appeals is de facto the Supreme Court of the United States, because they take so few cases. Usually, the federal appeals rules stand, and those become the law of the land, because the Supreme Court's hearing is a less than 5%, or less than some 1%, some tiny fraction. Doesn't matter what it is. The federal courts rule, and it just seems underhanded, like you said, Jack. 100% agree, right? The Jack and Jeff law firm say, smells funny to be able to do this. Insert another layer of, another layer of judging. Who decided that this needed to be heard by the en banc? It just stinks of politics. You know what I mean? The ruling to keep Brendan in just stinks of politics. You can just see somebody picking up the phone and say, "Hey, let's make sure Judge so and so is, making the ruling today." It just smells so badly.
Yeah, I mean, you hate to say the word at that level. You hate to even think the word corruption, but it does. So yeah, politics is a better word. It reeks of political favor, political whatever.
Payola.
It is absolutely disgusting. There you go. That's a good word. Payola.
Well, and it's an imperfect system run by imperfect humans that are driven by greed and other human, desires. So it's kind of baked in, which is sad. And I think we can work towards changing that. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be corruption by default, right? But I think the point that I want to make about it cannot be overstated that this discussion that we were just having about letting Brendan out is not about his innocence or guilt. It's just basically letting him out, waiting for his trial stuff to pass through. And I can't let that be lost here, that this is not a decision about his innocence or guilt. This was a decision about his lawful standing as an accused person under the habeas corpus statute. And following those statutes, he should have been released, period.
But Brad Schimmel, he's a player. He knows how the game works. He wanted to take away Brendan Dassey's voice. So could you imagine what would have happened? A news crew would have gone down to the Dassey residence, set up an exclusive interview, maybe even on 60 Minutes, because that's how big the case was. And they would have interviewed Brendan, some of his brothers, his mother, his father, etc., etc. And could you imagine the fallout that would have happened then? Brad Schimmel's no dummy. He knew he could not take that chance. So again, Brendan paid the price. He's a pawn in a political game. And that poor kid hasn't tasted any freedom and is in prison, in a prison cell, based on just words that cannot even be proved. And that goes to show that these guys, Jeff and the panel, they were openly corrupt. They didn't hide it. And I think Big Jeff made the comment, "Oh yeah, buddy, you owe me a favor." And that's exactly how it works. And Brad Schimmel would have said, the en banc panel, whoever he asked, gave permission to hold Brendan in. That would have given Brad Schimmel hope that the en banc panel was going to overturn Judge Duffin. So it gave Schimmel hope.
Brendan has to stay in prison until his appeal is resolved. It was a blow, but, Brendan's a rock here. He's our rock.
And his faith in us and his optimism is what keeps us going forward. This is one skirmish in a series of battles that is going to end in the Seventh Circuit, and we're ready to fight for Brendan, and we're confident that we're going to prevail.
From the co-op Correctional Institution here in Portage by Friday at 8 p.m. But right now, it's clear that's not going to happen. Stephen Avery is still serving a life sentence. He's currently being held in Duffin Correctional. He, of course, was the focus of that documentary, Making a Murderer. Avery's current attorney, Kathleen Zellner, claims new testing of some key pieces of evidence will clear him of that murder.
You want this? You want this hamburger?
Get me off that goddamn camera. I had a bad day.
Me too. I don't know what's Barbara going to do with her job. I heard she took a whole month off. How's she going to live? She got over $1,000 house payment.
The Federal Appeals Court has granted the state's request to keep Brendan Dassey in prison. Wisconsin Attorney General Brad Schimmel filed that emergency motion yesterday. This morning, 7th District Court of Appeals approved the motion for the stay.
And the timeline is the big question here. Federal court records show December deadlines for both sides to file paperwork in the appeal regarding Dassey's overseas.
That all sticks in my head. How many years of it?
This to me is almost like an analogy to what happened to Stephen in 1996 when Judge Hazelwood had to make a decision. Remember, guys, when they did that a rather primitive DNA testing underneath the fingernail scrapings of Penny, and the DNA laboratory found an extra allele that didn't belong to either Penny nor Stephen. It meant that someone else's DNA was underneath her fingerprints, underneath her fingernails. Judge Hazelwood could have released Stephen. However, Judge Hazelwood was not convinced that he basically said, oh, well, we don't know who Penny touched. It could have been a rescuer, could have been a husband, etc., and made the decision to send him back to prison. How shocking is that? And I thought the analogy really fit because Brendan literally had 1 foot out of the door and the door got shut. Very, very sad.
I think it's also a reality check for them as well. Like, Stephen is the other side of this case and they're watching developments with Brendan, and then all of a sudden the door closes back, and if there's no movement for Brendan, it kind of echoes the non-movement for Stephen. They're seeing more and more that they're going to fight. If they're going to fight for the nephew, for Stephen's nephew, or at this point her grandson, they're going to fight even harder to protect the conviction of Stephen. And I think that's the reality of it, that she's watching this going, oh my, they're not backing down.
And not only that, here's the scary thing, right, guys? She has seen it all before with her own son, Stephen. She's seen the whole process play out in front of her eyes previously with what happened to him, being, basically put in prison for something he didn't do. So this to her probably wasn't a shock or a surprise. She actually knew the veracity of the state. And I agree with you, Kellie. It has tremendous ramifications for both Brendan and also for Stephen.
And to not only that, you know that the state was not only considering Brendan's case as a whole, they were also considering what it would do to Avery's case if he were to get out, if Brendan was to get released. And, they knew, of course, but this time, Zellner was on Avery's case hard, and they knew the caliber of lawyer that she is. So I think that was probably another point, something else that they were heavily discussing. So I don't know. I just have this. I still have this real problem with the ability of the state to be able to do what they did and got away with again.
Brendan Dassey will remain in prison during the appeal process. Today, the 7th District Prison appeals
It's another day, and justice ain't there yet. The state will keep on fighting, and there's still more stuff on TV. He's going through the same thing I did. And you got your hopes up, and then the courts just shut you down again. Every time you turn around, you think something's positive, and then you just get kicked in the face again.
So the surface of the sink is hard and flat. And then you know roughly, where was it the state expert said the amount of blood in the car?
I believe he estimated 2 to 3 milliliters.
Yeah.
Something.
My recollection is 1 to 2 milliliters.
Yeah, so we got
from
6
his
spots
trial
in the
testimony.
car, but the spots are all small. And that's his estimate on it.
Yes,
Okay.
I think 1 to 2, he said.
Right.
It's actually very, very interesting. I looked at this, and I know Kellie did, and we're going to have a really good discussion here. But in actual fact, if you look at those 6 droplets of blood, you can actually work out how much a drop of blood is on average. It's around about 50 microliters. That means that those 6 drops of blood is actually under half a mil. See here on the show, they were talking about potentially 2 or 3 mils of blood. This is Stephen's blood. And then someone said, oh, no, maybe a mil. Let me tell you right now that there was probably under half a mil of Stephen's blood in that car, a tiny, tiny amount. So if you were a planter, all you need to do is to have placed it in a very small plastic tube, stuck it in your pocket, boom. So the point I'm trying to make is that if Stephen was extensively bleeding, actively bleeding, I'll tell you what, he did not bleed very much. And what is disturbing, and I'm sure Kellie will comment, is that for someone who's meant to be actively bleeding, he just left 6 drops of blood, including flakes that were found in the vehicle, but no blood was found on the ground or under the hood. So it seemed that Stephen somehow magically and conveniently bled only in the RAV4. Now, isn't that rather remarkable, guys?
Another man miracle.
By the Wisconsin Crime Lab that on this carpet, they found flakes, and I'm talking about the carpet right in front of the driver's seat. So there were blood flakes on this carpet, and the analysts picked those flakes up with tweezers.
Unless you have a considerable amount of blood on a carpet, you're not going to necessarily see flakes or drying effect, because with 1 or 2 drops or 3 drops, it's going to absorb right into the carpet, and to see flaking like that visually would be probably not very likely.
What if we open one of our tubes and drip onto this carpet? Okay, let's just watch what happens when we drip.
So we're seeing very small drops because they're absorbed into the carpet. Now, do you want me to make a larger amount?
Yeah, we could do another line of a larger, and then we could drip in the sink. So let's try in the sink if we just drip in there, and then we'll let it sit as we're talking, and we can compare the 2 surfaces.
Kind of like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we can.
Yeah. Okay.
That's going to take some time to dry.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Yeah, what you're seeing basically is the blood drying on the fibers.
Right.
If someone were to be processing this car for blood, I would expect that they would have taken the whole blood stain. They're quite visible.
Right.
You wouldn't be taking a flake off one of these stains.
What the state has represented to me is there were not blood stains, there were just flakes. She's not describing stains. She is not picking up flakes from stains. She's just picking up flakes, which tells you there's no stain there.
Right, which means that the flakes
are put
would have
there.
to come from a different source, whether it be from somewhere above. Although looking at the transfer stain on the dashboard, I don't see any evidence of that flaking.
And it would never land where this carpet is. This carpet.
It's very interesting what he just said. He doesn't believe that the stain near the ignition is the source of the flakes. That's very important because essentially if you leave blood on a surface, and I believe that Kellie actually demonstrated this, once that blood desiccates, it can potentially form a flake and peel off. Interesting that Kathleen Zellner's blood expert doesn't believe that those flakes had come from above, from the ignition switch. And I could suppose he can base that if those flakes had come from that source, they would have dropped straight down. My understanding where they were found, where the blood flakes were found, were more in the center part where the console was. So that begs the question. You obviously don't bleed flakes. So where did those blood flakes actually come from?
Before we even have, obviously, the discussion about the blood in the RAV, I think it's just an echo chamber about what I'm about to say, but I know that Dr. Silkman and the panel itself will completely understand what I'm about to say, and that is, it is, in my opinion especially, that the blood in the RAV is one of the most damning pieces of evidence that was used against Steven Avery. It is still, therefore, probably the most damning piece of evidence in the case as of today that Kathleen needs to overcome. She has given the state an alternative to how this could have happened. We all know that the Bobby narrative and the sink, we all understand it, we all accept it in terms of where she's going with it. And it brings a lot of opinions because, you know, like Dr. Silkman said, I have done a lot of experiments on myself. Again, I can't get it absolutely perfect. It's not 100% accurate, but it was the best attempt I could get. And I did it purely for myself as well, to really understand what the blood in the RAV meant and how it was possibly put there. Because the truth of the matter is, in this case, you are left to believe only two scenarios, and that is a planting scenario, that someone else put it there, or Steven Avery was in the RAV and he bled. So as for the flake thing, Jeff Jones, if you want to do this at another time, but maybe put the link of my presentation that we did on the live, just to, if anyone wants to review it again, because it's actually in it. And that is, I did do a flake thing. And what happens is different surfaces with blood, you know, it does form like settle a lot quicker, the coagulation, the drying stages. And I've always considered that, and I've never actually heard Kathleen's experts say it the way he just did. I've always I've missed it. And he says it comes from a different source. It could be from a surface and it's flaked off. And when I did all my experiments, I actually had that in my conclusion in one of my notes, taking that it could be as non-nefarious in terms of someone actually picking up the flakes and planting them versus that someone had put the blood in there. It had dripped onto a surface we haven't seen or wasn't discovered, and it simply flaked off. That could be like the center console or such. If you go back and watch my video, you will see it with your own eyes. I drip on my gear stick, and within, I think it's like a minute, you watch it absolutely, it pops and peels off and just sits there. With a little bit of movement or a little bit of friction in that car, it would have just dropped completely by itself, and you would have seen just a flake. You can see like a little bit of residue of where it had came from, but overall it's quite a clean surface. So I don't ever rule that out. I don't rule out the fact that it could have been put there. Well, it could have been flaked off from a different surface that we just didn't see. The drip was there, that it was like beside the chair and so forth. As for the amount of blood, I was able to do my full experiments with 1/10 of a mil. I was able to produce all the drips that I needed for this experiment in 1/10 of a mil. That's all it took. It was so tiny that I was like, this is interesting. You don't need, when I first watched Making a Murderer, and especially this part, I always thought you would need to have like an excessive amount. And I was like, that's insane. I actually needed less. However, there is a contrast to that. There's the other side of that. As much as it is absolutely favorable for Stephen, it is the fact that you don't need much. It also has that dark area as well, because I found in all my experiments, the less you have, the quicker the coagulation starts. So, we always said that there's a 30-minute window period of being able to take the blood and move around with it. And if theoretically it came from a sink theory. But again, the smaller the quality and the quantity, the quicker it absolutely is useless, because there's no extra fluid around it that's just constantly keeping it liquefied. It just dries out so quickly. So that's why I always say in all my comments when we talk about the blood is when we say 30 minutes, and I always say, and that's being generous, because in reality, the smaller, the quicker it turns. As we can see, she's using a purple top. A purple top is the EDTA top. We use that in all our hospitals. You'll see it throughout all doctor surgeries. It's the main, the key ingredient is EDTA. It's a preservative, so it doesn't stop coagulation. I think at this point, and again, the issue that I have with the sink is that they're doing dripping in the sink of blood, and they're just dripping it in there to get like an idea of how it would look and stuff. But I always go back to the fact that we do have an in situ picture of the sink and what it looked like in what condition. And I have, again, I'm happy to share that somewhere. Maybe I can share it to Jeff, and you can insert it in this part. And that shows that it has a lot of like residue from like soap or like toothpaste, and it's held. So I just wanted to remind you all that as well, that this is the sink that they're using is clean, and that they're not factoring in that there was other stuff in it at that point of time. Could that make a difference? Well, that's an interesting question, because I've always considered that. Like, I know that she's now had the aging of the blood done and it's come back to fresh blood, so it's kind of irrelevant now. But I always thought if she was still going to go down the pathway of the fact that Stephen vial was used, why would you not maybe try to see if there was a testing to isolate the compounds in the blood? Because if you're finding other things like toothpaste ingredients or soap scum, that would be another interesting cue. On the flip side of that is what a lot of people that are on the other side that believe in Stephen's guilt do still say, that if it's fresh blood, why are we not seeing some foreign things in that blood from when it was sitting in the sink, and we do see all this residue? So just things to ponder. I think maybe I'll let it play a little bit more now. That's just the baseline of the area we just saw, and we'll go from there unless anyone else has anything to say.
But I do have a question. In the case that you just described, Kellie, where you bleed onto the steering wheel, let's say, right, and what you say happened, it hardens up pretty quickly or flakes up pretty quickly and just falls off the steering wheel. In that case, and it's only a drop. In that case, would you expect a luminol of the steering wheel to reveal the fact that there had been blood on?
Yep, no question.
Absolutely. Yep.
So is
Absolutely.
this yet another poor investigation by our good friends at MTSO who couldn't bother to luminol the damn steering wheel? And then that would have been, okay, well, if we saw those blood droplets there, then we could reasonably conclude that, okay, he bled on the steering wheel and it flaked up and that's how it ended up on the ground. But now we're left to wonder because they couldn't do the damn police work. Or maybe they did it and they're not telling us.
Well, you're 100% correct, Big Jeff, and I'm sure Kellie will comment as well. What that car needed to have been done after they'd taken the samples was to luminol treat it. And luminol will give you entry points and exit points. In other words, you would have followed the blood, right, Kellie? You would have followed the trace of blood within that vehicle. They didn't want to do that because if there was no evidence of any form of entry or exit from that vehicle, then how is the state going to explain how Stephen's blood got into that car? Now, when they had a look around the vehicle, I remember Erdl saying that he found no evidence of blood on the ground. Now, we know there's A23, which is on the back door of the RAV4. We know there's Teresa Hallbach's blood. There's no question about that. But they never treated anything with luminol. Luminol would have given yet, and Jack 61 will back me up on this, they luminoled the hell out of the garage, right, to see spots and fluorescence on the ground. But they never luminoled the RAV4. But they did luminol, if I'm correct, the sink, Stephen Avery's sink, and it showed positive for blood. So when Stephen said he actually bled in the sink, he was correct. They did luminol treat it. Furthermore, they were able to visually see the presence of blood on the ground. So there were droplets of blood on the ground, also on door frames. So what Stephen said about him bleeding and entering into his trailer to put a piece of, I think he used duct tape, is correct. He definitely bled. And it would have been bleeding fairly savagely if he put a piece of tape to stop the bleeding. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bothered. So, and Kellie is correct. No one did any trace analysis to determine if there was the presence of any toothpaste, soap products, etc., etc. And of course, the FBI were only interested in the presence or absence of the EDTA. They didn't find any EDTA. So their conclusion was that blood was fresh. If you look at the DNA methylation analysis, it tends to indicate that the blood is fresh. In other words, from 2005. So the question is, do you rule the sink theory in or out? Can that blood be from another source? The only thing that I cannot explain, I can explain everything in that RAV. The only thing I have difficulty in explaining is the 2 droplets of blood on the seat, right? A9. A9 was the one that was used by the DNA methylation team to estimate the age of the DNA. That didn't come from a swab. It actually came from a seat cutting. So if you're going to prove a planting scenario, you have to account for how Stephen's blood got on that seat, whether you construct fake blood, and that can definitely take place, or whether someone was creative by removing blood from another source, for example, Stephen's Pontiac Grand Dam, and somehow able to reconstitute the blood and then drip it. Now, Kellie showed beautifully that it's very difficult to reconstitute blood once it's dried using water. But I'm wondering whether there's any other chemical that can break down the bonds that occur when clotting takes place, reconstitute the blood and drip it. Because remember, the blood cells are held together by protein. If you potentially treat the blood with protease, you can potentially loosen it up, right? So if you could break down the clot, reverse the clotting per se, it doesn't have to be pretty. If you can liquefy the blood, then you've got a source of blood. Only a hypothesis, only speculation, of course, but that's the hard thing to explain.
Yeah, and just echoing off what Big Jeff's question was in terms of, doing some more testing in the RAV. There is now, we've been looking at pictures going back for over a year now, a few of us in some of the Discord channels, and just reviewing it. And there appears to be, and I think we've even put it up in some of the previous podcasts, but there's posts that show that, there's pictures that show that there was blood stains that were missed completely and weren't even documented, weren't tested. There's one that appears to be on the driver's side panel, almost mimicking the back passage panel where you see the main drip, but this one's just like almost not even a quarter of the size. And no one ever mentions that in any report. It's just that you physically see it in a picture. And ironically, it looks coagulated. There's that ring around it where you see that crustation. So I always thought that was an interesting find. And there's few drips in the back of the RAV where it is alleged that Teresa laid. You see it on the left, which is opposite to her, which is a few drips, and then you see it on the actual base of where the door frame is. And then obviously we all are aware of the door frame itself, the back door. And just saying what Dr. Silkman was just saying in terms of rehydrate the blood, there is a method, but you have to have that kind of back knowledge to understand it. And you'll find that people in the lab or people that deal with kind of these kind of, I'm not to say cases, but, blood related issues, it's warm distilled water. So warm distilled water brings there's a component, the componency in it rehydrates it. It's really bizarre. It gives the cells rejuvenates them and hydrates them, but it's very, very complicated because in all the study that I did with it, it has to be balanced out perfectly. If you have too much distilled water, you will flush it out just like it would be in normal water. And if you have not enough, you'll make a pasty gel and it won't work. You have to have the right balance in terms of quality and quantity. Yeah, it's got to quantity itself out.
It's got to be isotonic.
That's the word, isotonic. Yep. So, and that's the only way to kind of get that to work in terms of a method of, old wives' tale in terms of on the spot kind of moments, in terms of there's probably other chemicals like aspirin that if you dilute a little bit of aspirin with some water and then mix it, you can kind of get it back to a liquid form because aspirin is designed to break down clots in the body. And that's why they always say if you ever feel like you're having a heart attack or a stroke, pop some aspirin. That's your first, point of contact, because that's what it's designed for. So yeah, in terms of the distilled water, I just wanted to hit base on that because it's something that it's so easy to be able to do, but you've got to have the foreknowledge of knowing how to do it and even knowing that distilled water versus normal water is an absolute difference.
Do you think a serologist has the skills to know how to rehydrate blood?
Oh, absolutely. That would be their training 101 because they would have dried blood and blood coming in all the time off bodies, of evidence, of items that you would need to collect to be able to then run it through. That would be their probably standard 101 training of how to collect dried blood.
Do you know any serologists in the Wisconsin State Crime Lab?
I do know of one, yes.
So do I, actually.
You personally, you mean, or just know of them?
Know of them.
Yeah, just to add before we wrap up talking about this, and it's way above my pay grade, but the aside from everything else that we've talked about, and I've talked about this before, two of my biggest problems with the blood in the RAV is number one, the flakes, as was mentioned by the scientist. I can't think of his name that we just watched a few minutes ago. And number two, and I really bitched a lot about this, is the CD case. There's a lot of problems with the CD case for me personally, because for me, I mean, we looked at the photos during the live, if you remember, guys, recently, and there's blood all over that thing. But not only that, if Stephen actually handled that thing, I would think that there would be his fingerprints at minimum smudges, if he had gloves on, which I don't believe at all, or his fingerprints. And on top of that, there would be Teresa's fingerprints and touch DNA all over that damn thing. And we're not, I mean, if they tested for any of that, we certainly haven't seen it. So that's my two big problems. The flakes, real issue there. I don't understand it. And this blood all over the CD case. It's another big problem to me for the state.
I just want to say about the flakes, though. This is the only problem that I want to touch base on. I get the confusion because I get so confused by it all too. But again, when I've done the experiments, and I spoke about before about how small of amount I needed, which was 1/10 of a mil. When blood dries, it goes through 5 stages, and if we're coming up to it, especially, but we watch Kathleen's reenactment. So right now she's using the purple top EDTA tubes, which is the vial that is alleged in the case, so from Dean and Jerry. So the issue is, when we see her reenactment of it, she actually gets blood freshly on the side of her, I think it's one of her paralegal team, and they drip it in there. And then they walk away for 90 minutes. And in 90 minutes, they come back and they were able to scrape some, and they were able to liquefy some up into a tube just to take away. So we had a few little levels there of different stages of the 5 cycles. My issue is, though, we're talking about that they just talked about how little blood that they needed here. And like I said, the smaller the blood, the quicker it dries as a whole, because it's got nothing around it to help it keep liquefying, because it's just it's more of a puddle than it is to able just to isolate itself out. This is why I get so fluffed in my head about it, because if you're going to take the blood from Stephen's sink, theoretically, the issue is, you have to ask yourself, at what stage of the 5 cycles would it have been in for that quickly? It either has to be at this stage basically flake already, because you've had to scrape it to collect it, and it took Kathleen 90 minutes to achieve the scrapings of the blood fresh, versus getting there and get it liquefied. And the issue is, if you get it and it's still liquid form, by the time you get to the RAV, you won't have flakes. It'll be just congealed gel. It'll have like that baseline to it. And then when you drip it, it usually, like with some of my experiments, I had clots formed in the syringe. So when I went to squeeze some out, it got stuck. And there is a video of me, which I don't think I took that out of the edit, but when I squirted me and my daughter on a road, a clot got stuck at the end, and I pushed it that hard that it squirted out, but the blood went all over our legs, because it just came out like this big, it was like this liquid behind the clot came out so powerful, because it was like pop. So my point is, the only issue is that I can't have it both ways. I can't have it to the fact that in a matter of minutes, it's absolutely still liquid, that they've grabbed it to be able to use it, but then in the next breath that it was also in flake form by the time they got to the sink. So this is why I can see why it's such a questionable thing in everyone's head, because when you really break down the cycles, it's really hard to understand at what point did someone get the blood. Was it completely dried out or was it still liquefied? And Kathleen in her experiments shows in hers, it took 90 minutes to achieve it. But in Stephen's narrative and what he's submitted to the courts to consider as his case, it happened within 3 minutes. So which one is it? Was it completely dry in 3 minutes or was it still liquefied in 3 minutes? Because the 5-stage cycle would have begun immediately.
Yeah, but there's a couple of very important points here, and that's why Stuart James is his name, I believe. That's why he made the comment and did the demonstration. And also you did as well, Kellie, that if Stephen Avery had actually dripped from his finger and it went directly on the carpet, it would have absorbed into the carpet. The only way you're going to get a flake, and he demonstrated it, was that the blood has to go on a non-porous surface and desiccate out. Desiccation means you lose all the water. It dries, and hence you can form like a crystal-like structure, a flake. So here's the problem. And Big Jeff, I'm sure everyone will agree, the actual forensic processing of the RAV4 was done so badly, it's a joke. Because had there been a surface in that RAV4 where blood was added and it desiccated and then it fell off as a flake, it would have left an impression, right, Kellie? It would have left a small little impression of itself where it had formed the flake and desiccated and peeled off. We've got no evidence of that at all because we don't have extensive photographs inside the RAV4. So the question that Stuart James is saying, oh, wait a minute, if blood dripped from Stephen's finger directly on the carpet, it would have absorbed into the carpet. It would not have formed a flake. Now, you're not going to start planting flakes, right? That doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is that somewhere in that car was blood that dried and fell off, peeled off, and formed those flakes. That makes much more sense. But because they didn't test the car and photograph it extensively, we're never going to find out.
We'll have to hold the rest of this conversation for next week. As usual, you guys are bringing a lot of clarity for me, but also maybe bringing up some new questions. And that's kind of par for the course, I think, here at Discussing a Murderer. So it is that time of the show that we toss it over to Big Jeff for his wrap-up comments. So take it away, Big Jeff.
Well, unfortunately, we didn't get through very much of the episode, and that's typical with the with this panel, and that's pretty much one of the reasons why I like doing it so much. But we really saw two things today. We saw the mid part of Brendan's appeal. I thought it was very sort of cinematography at the end of the Brendan segment. They kind of showed everybody turning off the lights, just like them turning off the lights on Brendan. Because they managed to put him back away. Until the rest of his appeal had made its way. Just very infuriating. I think the panel, that Brendan gets our blood boiling for good reason. We started off the forensic evidence, and the blood is always so fun to talk about. And just remember, tune in next Sunday. I'll be back with Jack. We'll be doing the depositions live, and for the 1985 case, he had those guys dead to rights. They were going to get whomped. We talked about it today in today's episode, how it wasn't even so much the money, but the uncovering of years and years of corruption, not just in Stephen's case probably, but many other cases as well. And to get him to silence this case, they needed a whopper, and that whopper had to include DNA because that's what put Stephen away in the first trial. It's what they needed in this trial. That's why I'm a whoops, I knocked my computer. That's why I'm a believer in the things that Kathleen Zellner is doing. I love the education of the people on the panel that can help guide us. The blood in the Rav is the most critical thing to overturn. Kelly's 100% right. So that's my discombobulated wrap up of what we saw. So on to the next.
Thank you there, Big Jeff. Jack, why don't you give us your take on today's episode, at least of what we covered, the whole 5.5 minutes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the forensic part of it. I gave my 2 cents there. The CD case, the blood all over it, the flakes. That's my 2 biggest problems. And much appreciation to Kel and Dr. Silkman's ability to talk intelligently about it. So I'm going to leave that there. But I want to read something from Judge Duffin's 91-page brief. It's not that long. It's only like 4 lines. But this is just the end of his brief. So, and then I'll end my comments. It is therefore ordered that Brendan Dassey's petition for a writ of habeas corpus is granted. The respondent shall release Dassey from custody unless, within 90 days of this date of this decision, the state initiates proceedings to retry him. The clerks shall enter the judgment accordingly, and this was on the 12th day of August, 2016. And I think it was such a brave decision and thing that he did. He's clearly, he's not a flitter, flatter, fly-by-night. He took a lot of time to go through this and to arrive at his decision, and how that was treated within the federal system is just sickening to me. Again, so that takeaway for in talking about Brendan's case from back then, 2016 up through now. I mean, we so wish that something would happen, that Now Ryder and Drizzen would file a 97406 or something that would move in Brendan's case, because there is nothing against Brendan that's holding him there. He is as far as I'm concerned, he's a political prisoner. That's my 2 cents. Great episode, a lot of really great discussion, and as we say, on to the next.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jack, for that. Dr. Silkman, a lot was said in this episode, a lot to wrap up. Give it to us in your own words.
Just very quickly, I think Kelly and I have to excuse ourselves from being on the panel. Otherwise, we're going to finish. We're going to finish MAM 2 in the year 2035, I think. But yes, look, just very quickly, I really love the discussion. I think we've got I don't think we do have a really great panel. A lot of different experience, a lot of wisdom here. And it's great to talk about the forensics. Really enjoyed doing that. Anything to do with Brendan Dassey really winds me up, and it winds everybody up. And I hope everyone in chat enjoyed the episode. And yeah, we'll catch everyone next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Silkman. And last but certainly not least, Kelly, if you wouldn't lead us out of episode 20.
Yeah, thanks again for a great discussion. As always, we don't get very far, but we get a lot in. I laughed when Dr. Silkman said apologies on our behalf, because we would probably finish in like 2035 or whatever it is. But this is what the case is about, right? We discuss it, we break it down. They are only opinions. Just because I'm weighing in on some experiences I had in terms of experiments, I'm not saying that everyone just should believe what I'm saying is truth. I encourage everyone, go out, read everything. If you have opportunities, do your own experiments. but I just wanted to bring a bit of value to the case in terms of what I can produce, and we can review it together. Thank you, everyone, again, and I will see you all next week.
Well, thank you, Kel, and thanks to everybody on the panel and everyone in the chat. Really appreciate your continued support. So for Dr. Silkman and Kellie and Jack and Big Jeff, this is Jeff Jones saying this has been Discussing a Murderer.